Afternoon and welcome. I'm Wayne Callan, and you're listening to the first of 4 ADHD Awareness Month webinars that Attitude is hosting during October. Today's webinar is about managing and putting in perspective the myths, stigma, and untrue statements that all ADHDers experience at home, at the workplace, and in the world. You've probably heard it all. ADHD is a made-up disorder, or is an ADHD for little boys, not adults, and many more statements not grounded in fact. Parents raising a child with ADHD and adults diagnosed with the condition often write in to us telling us about their encounters with stigma. It can come from acquaintances who don't know a thing about attention deficit, as well as family members who think they are experts on the disorder but really aren't. The problem is some of us take to heart all of those misstatements about ADHD and after a while mistake them for the truth. That's when the problems really start. Today, Michele Novotni will give us strategies and approaches for confronting stigma in our lives so we can carry on and move forward. Michele is a best-selling author, coach, and the parent of a young adult with ADHD. She is the former president and CEO of the National Attention Deficit Disorder Association, or ADDA. If you're new to our webinars, post your questions in the box at the right on your screen. Michele will give a presentation, and then she'll take questions for the rest of the time remaining. So now let me turn it over to Michele. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Wayne. All right, so we're going to spend the next bit of time talking about stigma and the shame that often follows with stigma. So again, as Wayne said, there are so many things out there people say about ADHD. People talk about ADHD being made up. They talk about it not existing. They talk about if you do meds, you're making your kids zombie kids. I've heard it all. And unfortunately, sometimes the information is even coming from doctors. People go to their physician and sometimes finally, they're ready for treatment and people say, oh, ADHD is just a bunch of poppycock. So unfortunately, we still have a huge problem. Not only do we have to learn to manage ADHD, but oftentimes we have to overcome the hills and obstacles that others put in front of us by thinking that this is a made-up disorder. Can you imagine if you broke your arm and people said, oh no, it's not really a broken arm. You should be fine. Go ahead and lift up that bale of hay for us. But that's what they tell people with ADHD. It's like, oh, you don't really have ADHD, just try harder. You can concentrate. Why do you always procrastinate? Oh, come on, you're late. You can suck it up and do it. And it gets to be a huge, 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 huge problem, and it creates a lot of emotional toil and shame too. So I'm going to talk about stigma, and I'm going to talk about the ways we can actually fight stigma and the damage that it does in terms of stopping people from getting the help they need, and then hopefully I'll help people get the help they need. And as Wayne said, if you have any questions, I'm here answering questions. I just type them up and Wayne will throw them at me when we finish. All right, I want to start with my plane trip I took last week. So last week I'm on a plane going to do a workshop on ADHD, and the person next to me was talking a little bit and saying what he did, and I told him, what I was going to do. I was going to go do a video shoot on ADHD. And he said, that's not really a big issue, is it? It's like, oh my gosh. And I mean, here was a really, really, really intelligent man, brilliant. In fact, he formed his own company, had hundreds and thousands of people working under him, and he was telling me that this was just a made-up disorder. So I asked him what field he was in, and he was an engineer, computer engineering. And so I said, I'm guessing you probably have a ton of people working for you who have adult ADHD and either don't know it or aren't properly treated. He's like, why would that be? I said, well, a lot of people, enter the techie fields. I told him about my son Jared, who's a computer techie guy now, and how that creativity can often work to the advantage of people. And he said, well, what would it look like in adults? He said, I don't have any little, big guys jumping around. It's like, well, as an adult, they don't jump around. I said, but I bet you have some people who miss deadlines, are late for meetings, don't prioritize things the way you say. He's like, oh my gosh, my staff. And then I said, and I bet you have salespeople who probably are wonderful talking to people, but they're a bear to get their expense reports in. He's like, oh my gosh, that happens. He's like, what's that have to do with ADHD? So anyhow, I had this guy on the plane next to me for 2 hours, and he was telling me all these myths that he heard about ADHD, and how if they took medication, they'd be zombie people, and you really outgrow it, and it's only the hyperactive. So I talked to him about the inattentive people who don't jump around, but their brain jumps around. And at the end of it, he turned to me and he said, I fly all the time. He said, this has been the most fascinating, best airplane ride I've ever taken in my life. And he left. He was going to get ready to fire one of his top salespeople because he said that this guy just wasn't consistent. He said he's great talking to people, but he doesn't do details. And I said, well, maybe he's not the person to do the details. And he said, well, he has been cornering one of my other salespeople to do some of the details for him. I said, so what if you paired them up as a unit? I said, I had one couple, and they were not married, but they looked like a couple ready to divorce, and they were just stockbrokers. And the one guy was very ADHD, and he would, if something came up, he was on the phone, he was drumming up business, excitement, and he was like all over it. And then his partner was the most detailed, linear, logical person I ever saw. She took something from step A and B and C and D all the way down to Z. And so she would start things and finish things, but she didn't actually generate as many starts as he did by a long shot. Unfortunately, my ADD guy, and Wayne, want to guess what he didn't do after he generated all that excitement? He never followed through. So there he had all this activity, and then he had all these people mad at him because they didn't buy it when they were supposed to buy it, and blah, blah, blah. So what I ended up doing was it was easier to get them paired up, and I asked the logical linear person, I said, well, does it matter to you where you start a task? She's like, you're supposed to start at the beginning. I said, I'm guessing he's a better starter than you are. I said, I'm thinking you guys could probably triple profits if you let him start, and then he gave it to you when he got tired of it, and then you took it from there to finish. And she's like, well, that's not how you're supposed to do it. I said, normally. I said, but you have the benefit of having somebody who's brilliant on this end and is really bad on that end. I said, now we could shore him up and get him a little bit better. I said, but he's never going to be anywhere near as good as you are on the back end. I said, and I don't know that we could do anything to make you as good as he is on the front end, so why don't we use the best of both of you? So they ended up doing that, and they kicked butt, and I think it was 3 or 4 times the profit just in the first quarter after they worked with me. And so I was telling my guy on the plane about this, and I could just see his wheels spinning. So after sitting beside this guy for 2 hours and talking to him about ADHD and sharing some stories, he left with a huge aha moment. He said that he was going to look at getting some support staff for all the poor ADHD people who couldn't do the details. He was looking at permanently pairing up these 2 people who had the opposite skill strengths. And he left with a very changed perspective of ADHD. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how do we shift this mindset that the media and everybody's perpetuated about ADHD being this made-up thing, or there's something wrong with you, you should be able to suck it up and do it. So that's what we're going to talk about. And I'm glad I got to sit next to this dude on the plane. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. So we're going to be exchanging emails. So we'll see. All right. So first, it's important to understand how stigma takes hold. A long time ago, back in the 90s, I actually wrote one of the first books on adult ADHD before it officially existed. So with ADHD, we have the problem that, according to the medical profession, adults could not have ADHD. And if you were a child with ADHD, you were going to outgrow it. So part of the stigma actually started in truth, because based on what we knew, just like people thought the world was flat because that's what they were told, based on what people knew, and I was a psychologist back at the time who was told adults couldn't have it, it was a child developmental disorder. And I kept on in my counseling practice working with all these kids when the parents would remember to bring them, and when they remember to pay me, and when they weren't too late, and like when they didn't forget their umbrellas or where they parked their car. And I keep on looking at all these adults who were doing what all the kids did with ADHD just in their adult form, and it's like, you know what? The psychology profession is wrong. Adults still can have it. So there were like 4 or 5 of us back in the 90s that put out books about the same time. saying there was such a thing as adult ADHD. So that's part of the reason why we have such a big problem, especially with adults, is because it started with the medical profession saying you couldn't have it. Now the medical profession said you can, but some of that started there with the truth. Then we have people who tend to abuse the ADHD label. For instance, I taught college for a while, and there were a number of college students who suddenly became ADHD-ish because they wanted to get the meds so they could stay up all night. Ooh. Okay.
That happens.
All right. Okay, let me undo those. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, there's a lot of commotion with all the hurricane stuff going on here.
Oh, yeah, right.
Okay, so back to stigma. So unfortunately, there were a number of people who tended to want to get medication just so they could stay up, and they could party. And there were some other benefits for people without ADHD. So then we have the people who abuse medication, and they give us a bad name. Then we also have the additional problem of people who don't properly diagnose ADHD. Again, unfortunately, there are a number of GPs who don't really understand ADHD, nor do they have the time, and their patients, for whatever reason, don't have the resources to see somebody more in depth. They don't have the time to. There aren't available professionals a lot of times. So many GPs do the best they can, and they, check off items from a checklist, and they say somebody has it or doesn't. So the problems are there could be a lot of kids who say have parents who are getting divorced, and they happen to look ADHD-ish. They're not paying attention, they're not focused. But you could not pay attention and not focus because you're depressed or because you're anxious or because you're overwhelmed. There's a variety of factors. So to get properly diagnosed, you really should have somebody who understands the different things that can look like ADHD but aren't, so that you get it properly teased out. But there aren't enough child psychiatrists to diagnose people. There really aren't enough adult psychiatrists who understand ADHD yet. And so the problem is we have a lot of people who don't know it in detail. And how could they? A GP treats, I don't know how many gazillion disorders, so there's no way they could be expected, to have more than a working knowledge of things. So the other problem is here that we do get people who are misdiagnosed and mistreated. In addition to that, we have people who say they use medication. Many doctors are reluctant to optimize medication. So somebody might take medication at the lowest possible dose, and then they stop. They say, okay, I tried it, it didn't work. Without going through the next level and the next level and the next level. I actually had one client that went through 11 medications and several doses until they found something that really worked for them. So again, there's all these myths that happen, but if something had 0 level of truth to it, it probably wouldn't stay as strong. So the problem is there is an element of truth in a lot of this stuff that people say. So you really need to understand that. So that's what causes stigma to grow, and then people say it as if it's true. I can't tell you how many people I've encountered in my life who claim to be ADHD experts, and some of the stuff they say, it's like, oh my goodness, no. And then when we have the neighbors who think they know better. I know my sister's son, I thought, had ADHD pretty clearly. And she said, oh no, I've talked to my neighbors, and I talked to the person at the child care center, and they said he absolutely doesn't have it. And it's like, okay, I travel all around the world speaking on ADHD. Your neighbor works with, I don't know, electrical circuits or something. It's like, okay, which one of us knows ADHD? So finally, many years later, she was able to get help for him. But the problem was that kind of stigma and that kind of misinformation stops people from getting treated early on. I know for me, my son Jared, who probably everybody's ever heard of me, heard me talk about him. He was one of the most hyperactive people probably in the world. If there was a World Olympics for hyperactivity, I think he would have won. He tore ligaments in my stomach before he was born for moving around so much. He had a rap sheet at the hospital before he was 2 that covered the back. They said they would have had to report me for possible child abuse because he was in so many times. He jumped out windows in our house, and he sprayed off in his eyes, and he jumped in pools and reflecting things in the mall. I mean, it was awful. And I was a psychologist who didn't specialize in ADHD at the time, and the doctors wanted to put him on meds. And I was a behaviorist, so I'm like, no, we're not going to medicate him. He's going to become a zombie kid. That's not what to do. And it never made sense to me why you would put a hyperactive kid on a stimulant. I wanted me on a stimulant to catch him, or I wanted something for him that would just knock him down. But I never understood about it being an aroused brain. So again, even as a psychologist, I still didn't quite understand some of the nuances of ADHD. And as a result, my son didn't get treated for several years, and it really was a problem. I mean, he was kicked out of daycare centers. He didn't have friends to play with. So it was really a big thing, and my husband and I couldn't go out because babysitters wouldn't do it even for combat pay. So that definitely creates problems. Okay, in addition, we have comments that create stigma. Teachers will be, oh, so you think he has ADHD. The media, especially the Wall Street Journal. There's one dude in the Wall Street Journal who writes the most horrible things about ADHD and stops so many people from getting help. There's books about ADHD. It's like, just eliminate this from their diet and they'll be fine. And for some people that may not, that may work, but that's not what happens with ADHD in general. I once did an educational seminar for teachers, and I actually had the principal stand up and say, I don't understand why we have to learn about ADHD. It's not even a real thing, and we have more than enough to do. So when you have people saying stuff like that, it's going to stop people from getting the ideas they need to treat it, for parents for getting the help. So next, we're just going to talk about the impact of individuals with ADHD with stigma. Because first of all, stigma really does stop people from getting treated. It stops people from getting identified. So many people don't want the label of ADHD because then they're going to be this bad person. And I know firsthand with the labeling. A long time ago, I was in several car accidents, and I was stopped all 3 times, and I was hit all 3 times while I was stopped.
Oh.
And so I started getting these nightmares about people hitting me. And so it got to be pretty bad. I ended up mildly depressed, and I ended up with nightmares. So they said I had PTSD. Now, the problem was they wanted me to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Oh, no, not again. Okay, so they wanted me to see a psychologist for ADHD. No, not for ADHD, for depression to help manage. And the bad thing was I was actually a teacher at the college where they wanted me to see somebody for PTSD. And I remember when they told me I was depressed and had PTSD, I remember running out of the office saying, oh no, I can't see them right now. I know I'm diagnosable. And I thought about that later, and I sat in my car thinking, oh no, I'm one of them. And then I thought, well, here I spent my whole life thinking how to empower people and telling them that it's okay if they have this or that and, whatever. And so here I was thinking, oh no, I'm one of them. And so it really caused me to think about, what did I really think about them if my reaction to being one of them was running out of the office screaming? So that really caused a lot of soul search, and I realized that there was shame with being on that side of the line for me. I was the one that fixed people. I wasn't one of those people. So we really have to get over the fact that whatever hand it is we're dealt, or whatever hand it is our partner or our kids are dealt, that's what we're dealt with, and we need to it is what it is. So let's just figure out how do we best manage it and go from there. But the shame with stigma, especially with ADHD, which is such an invisible disorder in many cases, it really does stop people from getting the help they need for being diagnosed, and it stops people from getting the help they need to be treated. And that's why I'm so passionate about trying to, fight the stigma so that we don't have to have this this barrier that shouldn't even be there. All right. All right, so based on the research and also based on my experiences, there's a 3-step plan for fighting stigma. And this comes out of the work of Allport and Kerrigan. And what just happened there? Is that showing up on yours too, Wayne?
Yes. Well, I have the Fighting Stigma slide. Is that?
Oh, no, mine jumped to,
But you had the 3 parts, the protest, educate. Yes, that is no longer up. Maybe you have to, there it is.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't. All right, you'll have to tell me what slides I have. I've just gone blind here. Let me see.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Let me see. Go to the webinar. Let me see if it lets me back in. I can only run one session at a time. Fine. Okay. How about you just tell me what the slides are and we'll go from there. So right now I've got the 3 parts. The protesting. Yeah. Okay. All right. So for the first part, and again, this is based on the research of Corrigan and Allpart. So they said that if we protest, that helps fight stigma, and if we educate, and if we have contact, those are the 3 main parts, and we'll talk about doing all 3 of those. So the first part is, if we do nothing, stigma is not going to go away. Unfortunately, silence really strengthens stigma, and if we don't say something, it's left as if it's true. So the first part is, when you hear statements that are untrue about ADHD, it's important to speak up and say something. You know, it's like, well, maybe that's the case for that person, but that's not necessarily true for all. Or, you know, come up with your reasons. But so many of us just sort of let something slip and stay there. And it's like, well, there's no harm in letting it just stay. But there is harm in letting it stay, because if you're quiet, it's as if you agree with it. And like if I had let the guy tell me that it was just a made-up disorder, you know, he would have left thinking that ADHD is a made-up disorder. Unfortunately, as I said, he sat next to me. So I protested. You know, so if you look at the steps, I protested. I said, well, no, that's not necessarily the case. I educated him. So again, we spent a lot of the part talking about the brain and how the brain's wired and how ADHD can look different and how, yes, adults can have it and it looks this way. And he had contact with somebody who was intimately involved with ADHD. So it wasn't just that I was reading him information from a book or, you know, handing him a piece of things. I told him about my son. I told him about some of my clients. I shared some stories and my experiences. And in 2 hours, this man left changed, and probably changed forever. So that's an example of how, if we don't just let it be, because I very easily could have just said nothing, and he wouldn't have known, and he would have just kept on believing it, and he would have believed that I believed it too. It's important when you educate to have information that they need too. And Wayne, you guys have a lot of resources up at Attitude that can help people with the education piece, right? Do you still have all those handouts and things?
Yes. Yes.
Do you want to tell them where those are?
Well, they're on the website. They're ebooks as well as free booklets. You should be able to see them, I believe, at the top of the website page, above the search bar. But there's a whole bunch of booklets on a variety of facets of this, stigma as well as how to move forward. And you should be able to find them on the website there. I don't have a URL, but you can find a link by looking above the search bar.
Okay, and there's also some great fact sheets that you can share. I know Attitude has a number of them. Also, Chad has a lot of fact sheets on ADHD that are wonderful that you can give people. And ADA, which is one of the other agencies too, also has a lot of really good information that you can share with people so that you can show them, well, you might want to check this out. You know, here's a place where you can get some other information. So first of all, I'd encourage you to, 1, protest individually whenever you get the chance, and also 2, protest corporately. You know, think about joining an organization like ADA or CHAD, where you can join with other parents and other families, and they can maybe help you navigate the system, or they can help you find some physicians who are familiar with ADHD. So again, protest individually, protest collectively. In fact, a long time ago, and I'm excited that we have ADHD Awareness Month, that was one of my early protests too. We got a U.S. Senate resolution passed, I guess it's over 10 years now. I actually helped write that to say that ADHD exists, it's a problem, and it should be treated. So again, as an organization at ADA, we actually wrote the U.S. Senate resolution protesting so many people not thinking it was a legitimate real disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, education, critical to educate yourself. And if you've heard things that stop you from getting the help you need, it's really important to get some more information. And again, I love a lot of the pieces you have on the Attitude website and the magazine, very readable, very easy. Chad also has a magazine called Attention, and they have a nice website, and ADA has a nice website and does a lot of webinars and seminars full of information. So educate yourself so that you know this is normal for somebody with ADHD. I currently do a lot of coaching, and I have a number of clients. I just, started with one recently, and she had told me that, there's so much shame that she feels ridiculous because she can't be on time for things, and she can't follow deadlines, and she can't do this, and she can't do that. She must be an awful person. I said, well, it sounds like you're a person who's not effectively being treated for ADHD. I said, I don't know if you've, killed puppies in your sleep or something like that. I said, but, not following through is a sign of ADHD. It's not a moral condemnation, but it can be a problem. And so you really need to educate yourself as to what ADHD is and what you can do about it so that you can feel empowered. Because just like if you had a broken arm, I don't know too many people that feel ashamed when they go into the emergency room with a broken arm. It's like, okay, if I broke my arm, I need to get help. But with ADHD, it's like, okay, I can't focus, I can't pay attention, I can't follow through, I make careless details. And it's like, and therefore, I'm an awful person. All right, and contact. It's really important to have contact. Have contact with people. They say that actually of the three, personal contact is the #1 way we can change people's belief system. I know with my son Jared, when he was little, I actually, even as hyperactive as he was, I had people in the Montessori school telling me that he didn't really have ADHD, and I would be a horrible parent if I sought medication for him. And I'm thinking, okay, he's got a rap sheet at the hospital, he's a physical danger. And once I understood that the medication would help his brain work normally, not just knock him out and make him a zombie, I mean, I really had to fight a lot of people who were telling me all this information, and it was wrong. They would tell me I didn't need to watch Jared that much. I know I even had him on a leash. And I don't know what you think about the leashes, but 30 years ago, to have a kid on a leash, I remember my first son was almost the perfect son. And I would see people with their kids on a leash, and I would think, oh my goodness, they're treating their kid like a dog. What's wrong with them? And then I had Jared, and we really physically could not catch him if he took off. He even took off at the pediatrician's office, and he had 3 nurses running after him. But I told him that they had said, leave him here, he's fine. And it's like, no, he's not going to be fine. I said, you're behind the wall, and the door's there. They're like, we do this all the time. You're just a over helicopter parent. And it's like, I don't think so. But anyhow, I left. I went in the office with the doctor, and then I heard a scream, and it's like, he's gone. And there were probably like 15 kids in there, but I knew it was mine. And sure enough, Jared had skedaddled down the hallway. He went in an elevator, and they were like running to catch him. So once they had contact with Jared, then they started to understand what I knew.
And don't a lot of kids who are especially hyperactive, they can actually, there's studies that they can actually hurt themselves. So I was just thinking it's important, that leash idea. I mean, parents have to be aware of that.
Yeah, because I know Jared really has gotten lost 2 different times when he was little. He escaped from people. And you're right, it's really a physical danger. Also we have, as people become teens, there's a lot of research that shows that they can do some pretty hairy stuff if they're not thinking completely and they're still impulsive. So that's a problem. Mm-hmm. All right, so Wayne, since I'm blind here, what's the next slide?
Someone has to move it.
Wait, let me see. Can
Fighting Stigma. Fighting Stigma also helps overcome shame, embarrassment, and feelings of inadequacy. That's the next slide.
Thank you, Wayne. All right, so what happens is with ADHD, oftentimes people feel pretty unempowered. And the stigma makes you feel pretty powerless. And so by fighting stigma, it really does help empower you. Like when I was with a group of people and we wrote the U.S. Senate resolution, you want to talk about a band of people feeling wonderfully empowered. It's like we actually made a difference. I know at the time we had contacted one of the studios who was producing a segment on ADHD that wasn't true, and we were protesting it, and they were going to play it anyhow. But I felt empowered that we at least kicked the dragon, and we told the dragon there was a problem.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we didn't win that time, but we didn't let it just stand.
Right.
And now over time we're starting to get things better. So there's a lot of power in helping to set the record straight to fight through the stigma. All right, what do we got next, Wayne?
Let's see, I need the next slide. Reasons to share your ADHD story with others.
Okay. Do we have a picture with that one?
Yes, a starfish.
Ah, that's what I thought it was going to be. Okay. All right, so in terms of sharing your personal story, as I said, of all the things that have happened over all the time, having people actually have contact with people with ADHD is the #1 thing that changes perceptions. Again, back when I was running ADA, we did a conference at a hotel, and I had told them that we needed a really big lost and found, and we needed way more people to help people navigate around than they've ever had before. And they're probably going to need a lot more keys made. And they just sort of looked at me, and they patted me on the head, and they said, yeah, we're fine. We do this all the time. I said, but this is for people with ADHD. It's going to be different. And they're like, you know, like just nodding, and it's like, you know, we got this. Well, by the second day of the conference, they looked at me after they had contact with 500, 800,000 people with ADHD. They're like, oh my goodness, this is what you're talking about. It's like, yeah, that's what these people struggle with all the time. It's real. And they went, oh.
Mm-hmm.
So again, when you finally start to get the contact, things start to change. And one of the favorite stories I have, because a lot of people feel like, what difference is it going to make? I love the starfish story. And again, this isn't my story. They say it's author unknown. But the story says a man was walking along a beach that was covered with starfish that had been left high and dry by the receding tide. And he saw a girl picking them up one by one and throwing them back into the ocean. And he asked, what are you doing? And the girl said, I'm saving starfish. If I don't throw them back, they'll die. Incredulous, the man replied, on this beach alone there must be tens of thousands of starfish, not to mention the thousands of miles of beach around the world. How can you possibly make a difference? The girl picked up another starfish, looked the man in the eye, and hurled it back far in the sea. Looking back at the man, she said, I made a difference to that one, didn't I?
Right.
So again, we might not be able to change the whole world all the time, but one at a time, we can change things. And like the man on the plane, I'm pretty sure he's going back to his HR department and going to talk to them about ADHD. And I'm pretty sure that guy that might have gotten fired isn't going to get fired, but he might get help for his ADHD. And I'm pretty sure that things are going to start to change. So you never know as you fight stigma where it's going to lead.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important not to underestimate the power of one. All right, what do we got next, Wayne?
Picture of your son, Jared.
Ah, Jared. All right, that was Jared when he was graduating. So if I would have listened to all the people with what they all told me, you know, I wouldn't have gotten Jared help for his ADHD early on, because what I was told was, boys will be boys. This is normal. It wasn't normal. I don't know if Jared actually would be alive right now, for real, if he hadn't been helped with the ADHD. He was highly, highly impulsive and distracted. Jared graduated with his degree. He has a graduate degree in computer science from McGill University in Canada. If Jared didn't get help for his ADHD because he didn't need it, they said, you know, I don't know that he would have a college degree right now.
Mm-hmm.
If I would have believed people who said I should have spanked Jared, I should have punished Jared, you know, he was a bad kid. I mean, Jared did a lot of bad things, don't get me wrong, but he never intended to do them badly. I mean, like, he never like set out on purpose. He just was very, very, very impulsive. If I would have listened to them, I might have punished Jared for being ADHD. and he would have had all this shame about ADHD. Instead, he sort of has come into his own. He understands that's how his brain's wired. He understands there's things he likes to do, things he doesn't. So he's learned to manage it. He also ended up getting himself a job, his first job, which was the most perfect ADHD job, I think, in the world. He had the ability to come into work whenever he wanted, as long as he just worked 8 hours anytime during the day.
That's great.
So he could come in when he wanted, leave when he wanted. He just had to log in 8 hours of work. They got to wear whatever they wanted in the office. So for dress down Fridays, he would often wear a tuxedo T-shirt he had to get dressed up, because sometimes he'd come in pajamas and shorts, and it didn't matter. So he loved that. They would take projects off the wall and work on it until they got bored with it or got stuck with it, and then they'd put it back on the wall with the next step for somebody else to pick up. They had a manager who would manage all the details for them and keep them out of harm's way, so they didn't really have to interact with the customers. They had this guy take care of all that. All they had to do was focus on solving the problems. ADHD heaven. But Jared also understood, what works for him with the way his brain works. And that's the kind of thing I wish every parent with ADHD would help instill in their child, and every adult with ADHD would understand on their own too, that this is the brain you've been dealt. For now, we can't change it. There are ways to manage it. And coaching is all about empowering people with ADHD too. It's like, what strategies can you use? I know a lot of people with ADHD try to get better organized. But unfortunately, they tend to be following advice of organizing people whose brains are very logical and linear. Well, that's not the way people with ADHD's brains work. So sometimes I had people who used to save receipts by throwing them in basketball hoops at the bottom of their car. Or, now we have wonderful apps that you can scan things. And when you scan them, then you don't have pieces of paper, which is wonderful. So again, you have to think about ways that work. I have so many parents that say, but this is how I did my homework, or this is how you should do business receipts. Maybe for somebody with ADHD, they need to do it differently. We're so politically correct right now about so many things, but not ADHD. So, maybe we ought to start wearing signs, all brains matter or something, and start a movement.
It's a great bumper sticker too, yeah.
All right, so basically the steps to fighting stigma are protesting. And you never know where a protest is going to lead you. And again, I'm not talking about marching in the streets, but, just not letting comments stand. Educate people, contact and connect. And again, I can't encourage you enough to contact a lot of the organizations where you can find a ton of support, which will help you feel better about fighting this shame and stigma and moving on. So that's all I have for information, I think. Right, Wayne?
Yes.
Okay.
That's it. We have some questions. There's a mom of a 15-year-old son and he is against taking medication. He's been diagnosed with inattentive ADHD, and he has a learning disorder. And she asked, do you have any suggestions she thinks he's going to need medication. Do you have any suggestions about how to support him without making him feel broken?
I think the most important part, and that's a great question, would be to help him understand how his brain works. So the more educated he can become about what his brain looks like, where ADHD is and the prefrontal cortex, and the fact that the neurotransmitters don't work effectively. So I think the more we could make it a real thing, help. Also, I've had a lot of success recently with especially people in that age range getting the quotient. It's a computerized test that tends to show how you make out on different ADHD symptoms. Mm-hmm. And they have bar graphs at the end of it that'll actually show you where normal is and where you are. So I've been using that a lot for people who were on, say, a little bit of meds and thought they were fine and they didn't want to take more because somehow more was bad. Or people who thought they were fine and didn't need meds. So the quotient test, again, a lot of people can do that now, makes it very concrete because it gives you a bar graph that shows where you are to normal.
Where would people be able to access that? I mean, do coaches or physicians have that, or how does one take the quotient test?
Quotient test, okay. It would need to be a psychologist, psychiatrist, or I think some coaches may have it. I guess maybe go to the quotient and then see who might be trained in the area. So that would be one way to make it clear. The other way I've had a lot of success would be with kids and their video games. So I've had kids who said they focus fine enough. So I had them play their game off meds, and then I had them play their game on meds. And then they're like, oh, I do way better on my meds. It's like, yeah, that's how you would do with your homework too. So, so sometimes if you can make it concrete for them, and I have had kids who have said, I'm not taking meds, I think it's, going to poison my system. It's like, okay, then we need to find at least 2 times more time for your homework, or we need to talk to the school about making accommodations, because it's going to take you longer. So again, I think the most important part is going to be educating them about his brain and what that means as concretely as possible.
What about the whole stigma attached to ADHD medications? We all know that parents struggle with that decision to sometimes put their child on medication. We know how effective they can be from studies, but there's 2 levels of stigma. There's sort of, what the parents think about them, and also sometimes when you reach the teenage years, teens don't, it's just not a cool thing to take. They feel like they'll, so that's a challenge, but yet they're very, very helpful.
Okay, medications are a really interesting one. And again, I've probably done the biggest flip of anybody in the world on this issue because I started out a behavioral psychologist who was no meds no matter what. I really believed that it was behaviorally oriented and that I could do behavior management plans, and parents just weren't consistent. And I think God gave me Jared to teach me differently because my husband's an educator and I was a behavior specialist who consulted with all the other behavior specialists and helped them. And so I really had to learn that it really was physiological. And now I actually have been consulting with pharmaceutical companies like for the past 8 years, helping them educate parents about the non-medication strategies that go along with their medication strategies. So the important part would be for them to understand physiologically how this works. And for me, that's what turned it around. If we think about the 3-part system, it was the education. Once I understood that ADHD is physically an under-aroused brain, the messages really don't get to where they're supposed to go to. We have all the executive functions can be impacted. And the medication, for the time it's effective, helps restore the brain to more normal functioning. So once you understand that piece, then you have to weigh, are the risks of taking the medication worth the benefit of having my brain restored to normal for this period of time? So I still respect people who decide to use meds. I respect people who decide not to use meds, and I love the people that are willing to do everything, anything, from yoga and doing exercise and, doing whatever you can to manage it. But I think the most important part for fighting the stigma is to understand the physiological part of the brain. And some of the websites even have pictures of the ADHD brain that really in detail show you where things are going on. So that's the most important part. And when you become a teenager, actually you don't want your teen to let people know they take ADHD meds because everybody else wants to take them to help them stay up. Yeah. And it's sort of funny, and a lot of parents will tell me I don't want them to be addicted to meds. Most of my patients with ADHD forget to take their meds a lot. So one of the big things we're always trying to do is get them to remember to take their meds. So there's a lot of research that show that it's not addictive in that way to people who have ADHD because it actually settles them down. It doesn't, perk them up as much.
Right.
So, understanding what it really does and why it does what it does would be the important way to help fight that kind of stigma.
A real short one. What is a good book about shame? Several people have asked. Is there any book that you might recommend?
I'm thinking Sari Solden had one on shame. What's it called? I don't remember. Okay, but yes, if they look up Sari Solden, I know she's written a lot about shame, especially shame in women. And her messages are always very, very powerful, very heartfelt, just helping you get good in your skin. I also think Chris Dendy had did one with the teens. I know she had a book where, I think it, don't remember the name right this second, but her son Alex had told his story along with some of the other stories of some of the kids, and that was helpful.
Right. Okay. Well, Sari is S-A-R-I, Solden, S-O-L-D-E-N, for those of you who want to Google her. And Chris Dendy is Chris, C-H-R-I-S, Dendy, D-E-N-D-Y, in case you want to Google her as well.
Oh, and Ned Hollowell does a beautiful job on shame, too. Just remembered him. Okay.
Ben asks, it's one thing to sort of correct your spouse or mother-in-law about not understanding ADHD, but how should I handle it when my boss comes out with a boneheaded statement?
Delicately. Okay, so if ADHD is supposed to be officially protected, if you go to your HR department and say you have ADHD and you need the following accommodations, my experience has been, and again, I coach a lot of people who are on the verge of losing their job or whatever. If you have to fight to get accommodations for ADHD as a boss, like in the workplace, I've generally found it to be more effort than it's worth, unless it's just like the only job in the world that you can get. So it's important to put yourself in a good position. I don't know that I would correct my boss per se, because if the boss is the kind of person that makes boneheaded statements, you might want to actually be more incognito there. Unless it depends. So I mean, sometimes I have people hire different people to work for them, like say to organize their receipts or to proofread reports. Again, there's a million accommodations. Some people I coach, and every day I help them tee up their priorities and what do they need to be focused on. So they might want to manage those kind of symptoms, but in general, if it's a real problem, you could go to the HR department and see what they would do. But yeah, anybody that makes boneheaded statements who unfortunately has power over you puts you in a really delicate position.
Yeah, right.
So
and it's confidential with HR? I mean, if that is brought up, I believe it usually is.
Well, it is, but the problem is the accommodations aren't. So once they start saying so-and-so needs to be able to wear headsets, or so-and-so needs to have like notes taken after a meeting, then everybody knows you have ADHD anyhow. So yes, in theory, it's confidential. But it's not really, if that makes sense. So generally, when you're fighting, and again, I believe in fighting all sorts of things, but if you're fighting in a workplace, usually they're going to find some other reason to get rid of you if they want to get rid of you because of ADHD. So again, there are ways to do it, and it has been done, and I have helped people do it. But generally, I'd probably, in that situation, recommend keeping your mouth shut unless an opportunity just sort of arose, like maybe on a picnic or something. If they're talking about kids and your kid has ADHD, you might throw something out. I don't know. But yeah, workplaces you have to be careful with still.
Sally asks, after years of hearing criticism for my missteps due to ADHD, I tend to overlook my successes and spend most of my time going over my mistakes. How can I break out of this cycle? She doesn't seem to celebrate her successes as much as, bemoan her mistakes. That's an ADHD thing, isn't it?
Oh, very, very, very much so. In fact, in coaching, that's the first thing. In fact, every coaching session I have, I always start with, so what's been going well? And I can't tell you how many people always start with what's going wrong. And I mean, I've been coaching some people for a couple of years, some of the people, and it's like, no, what went well? He's like, why do we have to do this? It's like, well, because this is really important, because if you build on your successes, you have a nice, strong foundation. If you just build on your failures, like I could have been, say, a car mechanic. I'm in the bottom 5% of the aptitude in the whole world on mechanical ability. That's really low. Now, my IQ is really high, so I may have been able to make it through. I'm not sure. However, I don't think I would have been a very successful mechanic. I think every day of my life would have been an absolute living hell as I
Mm,
tried to make my weaknesses better.
right.
So one of the biggest things is to really celebrate successes. And I know a lot of my clients go, but yes, but I have all this. It's like, yeah, and if what you pay attention to grows. So if you're paying attention to only your failures, it's going to get hard to get excited about your successes. I know I read somewhere that it takes 7 positive comments to undo 1 negative comment, and that includes self-talk. I was doing a group, I had an adult ADHD group I was running, and I still remember this guy, Chuck. And so their mission for the week was anytime they did a negative comment, they had to do 3 positives. We weren't going for 7, but we were going for 3 positives. And so
Hmm.
everybody left all fired up, and then they came back. And so I was going around the room saying, okay, so what went well, what went well? Well, Chuck said, Doc, I couldn't do the 3 positives. And so I looked at him sort of quizzically. It's like, okay, so how was that a positive? He said, well, I stopped talking to myself instead. It was too expensive.
That's
But
funny.
but that but that was huge because I have so many
Hmm.
people who have heard, say, a boss say, you're late with this again, and then it just ruminates and they put it over. I'm late for this again. I'm always late, and then they sit in it. In fact, somebody had said it's like sitting in a poopy diaper.
Hmm.
They just sort of stay put there, and it's hard to get motivated and excited if what you're focusing on is your negative. So if you tell yourself something negative, it would be really good to try at least 3 positives. And if it's too expensive for you to come up with 3 positives all the time, try Truck's strategy and stop the negative self-talk.
Hmm. Yeah.
And again, coaching can be really effective in helping people learn to do that so that they can focus on their successes and then build on them, to do what they want to do in the way their brain's wired to do it.
Hmm. What about the value in terms of overcoming stigma of support groups, whether they be online or meeting weekly? We did a survey once, and a lot of ADHDers told us that their best friends are fellow ADHDers because they're totally understood and they're totally relaxed in their presence. Uh, is that a good thing? Is that a beneficial thing, the support groups?
Support groups are critical for people on the journey, especially on the front end of the journey. So groups like CHAD and ADA, CHAD has physical meetings in a number of locations. ADA has
Hmm.
virtual ones,
Hmm.
and that's chadd.org and add.org. Wonderful, wonderful support systems. I know my father, who we identified in his 60s as having ADHD. I told him that he really needed to come to a conference so that he can be around others with ADHD.
Hmm.
And I remember he told me, he said, well, I can be pretty damn annoying. I don't know if I want to be with a bunch of others. And
Right.
he went to his first conference probably in his 70s, when he was like 70 something. And he had an absolute blast because my dad wasn't hyperactive. He's like West Virginia lethargic. And so he was able to see people whose brains were going and who cut each other off on conversations. It was just the best environment in the world for him to be in. He absolutely loved it. So I think part of what it does is it shows you still can be successful in your own way and that you're not broken and you're not defective. You're just wired different. And this is what you've got, but that doesn't mean you can't soar. And so I would encourage everyone to join a support group of some sort, whether it be a virtual one, whether it be a physical one. Go to conferences. I know Chad's going to be having a conference in October soon. If you can get yourself to a physical conference. But the support groups are absolutely wonderful and brilliant, and I think you'll find yourself there. And I think a lot of people also, I know on your website, you have a lot of statements from people and, people writing back and forth and blogging about ADHD too.
That's addconnect.com. Yes, there are support groups on our site as well. So addconnect.com. Yes, and it's very helpful, and so many people use it, and everyone is very helpful. For every question that someone has, there are a bunch of people pitching in trying to solve it for them. So it's
Right,
a good resource.
Yeah, and they don't have to reinvent the wheel, which is what I like.
No.
Because people have already figured out, there's this many apps that tend to be helpful for people with
Right.
ADHD, or there's this many things that you do here. So again, make your life easier. There's even support groups for non-ADHD partners. Gina Pera has one of those,
Mm-hmm.
P-E-R-A.
Mm-hmm.
Because the people who live with people with ADHD sometimes pull their hair out. It's like, oh
Right.
my goodness, why can't they do this? And so there's support groups for people who live with people with ADHD too, so that they can get a handle on that better too.
Mm-hmm. Uh, One parent asks, I want to address kids again. She wants to try to educate her son's teachers about ADHD. She's brought it up before, but they don't seem to understand. Her son doesn't have an IEP or 504 plan, but every day he's frustrated and she's frustrated because the teacher tends to, unfortunately, yell or sternly reprimand the son for acting out or a variety of other things related to ADHD symptoms. So is there a graceful, productive way of educating a teacher?
Um, if it's a public school, uh, I'm almost thinking that sounds like a private school, but if it's a public school,
It's
I
a
would,
public school.
it is a public school.
Yeah,
Huh,
yeah.
okay. So in a public school then, one, I would request a teacher change before the years goes too much further.
Mm,
Because if you have somebody who yells and believes in their heart that ADHD kids are just bad,
mm-hmm,
at best they'll minimally follow an IEP or a 504 plan, but they're not going to be the one to inspire your kid. They're not going to be the one to see the strengths in your kid.
mm-hmm,
So, I mean, you can educate them to an extent, but my first recommendation would be to get the kid out of that class and request a teacher change pretty quickly. I
mm-hmm,
also I also would recommend getting an IEP or a 504 plan, because what that does is that gives legitimacy to the fact that this is the way the kid's wired, and these are things the child needs, because yelling is not going to be on anybody's IEP plan. And so the IEP plan can be a really nice, the meeting itself can be a nice way to educate the teacher, if you're still stuck with the teacher, but I would hope you would move, because so many teachers are so
mm-hmm.
kind and compassionate and much better. But anyhow, the IEP meeting is a way for everybody to get educated, because ADHD, one of the other problems is it looks so different. You can have a hyperactive kid running around, and you can have somebody who hardly moves staring out the window, and that's ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I'd love, Rick LaVoy said this a number of years ago. He said, if you're having a really good day at school, stay home. He said, because if you can focus and knock out your work, he said, they're going to hold that against you every other day of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Because ADHD fluctuates and people don't get it.
Right.
So that would be it. Also, you could use ADHD Awareness Month, which is October,
Mm-hmm.
maybe to give some books to your school on ADHD, because there's a number, like Chris Dendy has a beautiful book on ADHD for teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Reef, also Sandra Reef has a really nice
Yes.
one. So you
Yep.
might want to buy a couple books on ADHD for educators, and offer to have that for to bring that to school for ADHD thing, or maybe you can get one of the local groups to see if they could do workshops. So
Mm-hmm.
again, I would start with maybe some books or articles for teachers. Somebody had a really nice list of things, like 20 things that teachers could do to help kids with ADHD. Was that one of your articles?
I don't know offhand.
Okay, I think there are some of those that you have in Attitude, like for the back to school issues. So somewhere, if you Google it, I'm sure you can find things that teachers can do to make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But
Once again, Sandra Reef is Sandra, R-I-E-F, if you want to Google her. And that book is excellent. We have it here and consult it a lot, a good part of the time. So I think, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the hour. But I wanted to thank you again, Michele. You really provided some answers and perspective for me. And I'm around this stuff all the time. So I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience does.
Okay, thanks. It was
So,
good to be here, and hopefully we can help keep the ball rolling and change some things. And
right.
again, if people have individual questions that weren't answered that they're not able to do, again, ADHD coaches can be a really good resource. I can't tell you how many pitfalls I've helped my clients, just sidestep based on the knowledge. And again, there's a number of psychologists that are very knowledgeable as well. Coaching's
Right.
done virtually, so it's, you just call up on your phone or can Skype. Psychologists need to be in your area. But again, there are resources for people who can help you navigate this if the general information isn't helping enough.
Right.
So just keep trudging along. And then maybe
And
your
go
I'm
ahead.
gonna say maybe your kid will be kicking his heels up like mine did, at least for
Right,
now.
right. Well, hopefully, yes. Just for everyone, you can reach Michele at michelenovotni.com, her website. And finally, we're grateful for all of you listening in. Next week, Lois K. Heyman will talk about auditory processing disorder, which is often confused by doctors with ADHD. This webinar should be able to clear up all the confusion about that. Hope to see you there, and have a good day, everyone.